good. I was going to say good morning, but it's afternoon time right now. It's very hot outside, so I'm going to still be doing some sessions inside, and hopefully you can hear me better. But today we're going to talk about our relationship with authority figures, such as pastors, teachers, police officers, government, anybody who is an authority figure within your life. In the scriptures, in the Bible, it establishes a godly relationship of um, difference and submission to God established authority. In 2 Samuel chapter 20, the last part of the Bible verse, it says, "The men of Judah clave unto their king," the king being the authority figure, "from Jordan even to Jerusalem." Okay, and then First Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 15. "Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors, for so is the will of God." So God is actually telling us that we need to submit and follow these people that have authority over us. So the church was endowed by Jesus and ministries to build up the faith and maturity of his believers. And this is talked about in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 8. And then 11 through 13, it goes back into it. And I'm going to read that. It says, "When he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come in the unity of the faith and of knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ." Now, many people distrust their churches and their governments today because of broken soul ties or relationships, bad relationships they've had with the leaders. And men in the churches, not just men, but it could be women also, because there's some women leaders, men and women in the churches and government who were trusted, and then to whom you might have submitted to, or people might have submitted to, or gave their submission to, betrayed that trust, and then the people were wounded. And I know that we've seen a lot of this going on lately because there's been uprise within our country, and simply due because I think people are feeling betrayed, or they're they're kind of confused on what the leadership is doing and different things. But I don't want to really get into that. But a pastor can function effectively if the bonds of love and trust have been established between the church and him. And trust must be established like that of a patient to a doctor, or a client to lawyer, or client to counselor. There must be definitely a trust that whatever someone comes and talks to the pastor about, that it's not going to be talked to his wife about and then spread through the gossip line in the church. So the pastor has to keep this to himself. He can't just go and talk about other people, what people bring to him, because then he would be betraying them and breaking the trust. And the pastor should have the same spirit of love and concern for the rights and well being of the believers in his charge or in his church that Christ has for his sheep, being the believers. Love is a two-way street, and the same is true of soul ties. Every soul tie is a conduit. So in the Old Testament are several instances of soul ties between man and God and their leader or figure or authority figure. Joshua and Moses. Moses was the authority figure, and Joshua had submitted underneath Moses. Elisha and Elijah. Elijah was the leader of Elisha, and Elisha followed underneath Elijah. And clearly in the New Testament, between the disciples, we see, and Jesus was Timothy and Paul. If man rejects the godly established authority, then the result is rebellion, which we're seeing a lot of riots. That's actually rebellion right now, and the rioting and just everything that you're seeing, the protest, that's all rebellion. So that's even talked about here in the Bible. So it can result in rebellion and anarchy, which we're seeing a lot of right now. Also, by contrast, if the authority is not godly, the results are ungodly. If the head is sick, then the body is sick. So if our leadership is sick, the whole country, if I'm talking about leadership, our government right now, if the government is sick, then the whole country is going to be sick. If the pastor is sick, then the whole church is going to be sick, is basically what they're saying. So, and that's sick referring to being ungodly, evil, not good, anything that's against God. So, imbalanced soul ties of devotion that led to self destruction occurred in World War II when certain devoted followers of Hitler and Tojo became suicide warriors, such as the kamikaze pilots. And I know everybody knows that the kamikaze pilots, well, if you're my age, you know, you've heard of them, but if you're younger, kamikaze pilots were those that were willing to commit suicide, dive in their planes to kill people or to hit certain things to destroy them. And they were known for their suicidal acts. They were from Japan. And their soul ties and devotion led to the destruction of the very lives and souls that they had hit. So that was an ungodly soul tie. The Israelites too demonstrated an example of an ungodly bondage to a leader. Actually, they had a lot of really ungodly bonds to leaders, but we're going to talk just about a one or two. Contrary to the will of God. And this example that I'm going to talk about, the men of Israel had rejected David, God's anointed king. The fruit of this was not only to miss God's best, but also to find themselves opposing God. So, because they didn't respect David as the king that God had anointed, then they were rebelling against him. And that was also setting them opposing God because God had picked David. And then we can see this in 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 2. It says, "So every man of Israel went up from after David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri." The actions of authority figures affect their followers. So when King, oh, I know I'm going to say this wrong, but Astarias, okay, it's going to be in Esther 3, that king there. I can't say his name. It's just not my language, sorry. But when he came under the influence of Haman, there was a spiritual effect upon the people of his kingdom. When the head becomes involved in evil, there is a spirit of confusion loosed that affects those under his headship. And they may be totally unaware, or they may not be sure or what to do or what to think on a conscious level. And they may be totally unaware of what is taking place in the mind of their leaders, but they are influenced nonetheless. So if they're following the leader and the leader becomes ungodly or becomes evil, because they are following and have submitted to that leader, a lot of times they just follow into the evil acts as well. And that's what was happening in the time of Esther. And if you've seen that movie, you can remember that Haman wanted all the Jews to be killed, and he wanted to get rid of them, similar to like what Hitler was trying to do, is to get rid of all of the Jews. And he was not aware, and the king was not aware, that Esther was a Jew. And Esther came up to the king, and she was married to the king, and had asked him to spare her people. And that's when Haman ended up getting in trouble. And that's going to be, if you want to read more on the story, it's Esther chapter. It's in the book of Esther, but I'm going to read one thing out of Esther chapter 3, the last part of verse 15. And it says, "And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed in confusion." Okay, so the city's already kind of confused because they had already put out the decree that they were going to start killing Jews and whatever. So now the country, because they had been working with Jews, they had Jews as friends possibly. Now they're confused because now they're supposed to see these people die, or they're supposed to kill them. But correspondingly, when the king had repented of what he had done after Esther came to him, or when a leader is restored to his right mind or to godly behavior, the people will feel a lifting and will rejoice. So the country that's following a bad leader, but yet that leader all of a sudden comes to his right mind and starts doing good things, the country will feel that heaviness lift up. And so Mordecai, which is Esther's uncle, went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen, purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Now, that's what happened once the king found out what Haman was trying to do, because Haman really hated Mordecai, because Mordecai would not bow down to Haman, because Mordecai stated he would only bow to his God. And so once the king realized what was going on, he gave Mordecai a higher position, and he honored him. So that was what was going on in there. Okay, when a godly individual is exalted, or was exalted back in the day, the king restored to godliness. The city rejoiced and became glad, no longer perplexed or confused. Notice that the entire city in that story was blessed and rejoiced twofold, with joy and gladness. And at the same time, the people of God within the same city were perhaps even more blessed, fourfold, receiving light, gladness, joy, and humor. Definitely a big dark cloud had been lifted off the Jews, knowing that they're they can fight. Their death was not imminent coming, so they were able to, take joy and that part right there. But what caused the difference in all of this? In the former instance, the one in spiritual authority was under the influence of an ungodly sultai, or cooperating with evil. In the latter, the case, the king was restored to a godly influence and brought his nation back under God's blessing. So Hebrew chapter 13:17 says, "Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls." Now, to me, that kind of, I want to talk about pastors, because to me, that verse right there reminds me of pastors, because pastors are the shepherd of the church. The church is the flock, and pastors' responsibility is the souls of their flock. And so, if we have a pastor that is ungodly, or he's not preaching the truth, and he's leading his flock down a different path, or not the right path, because he's teaching a different type of gospel, not the kingdom, then he is going to be held responsible for everybody that he's leading. If they don't end up in heaven or in the kingdom, if they end up in hell because of something that he taught them, he will be held responsible. So being a pastor is a very crucial um, responsibility. God does not take it lightly. So we need to make sure that if you're in a church and you have a godly pastor, please keep him in prayer, because the enemy always is trying to take that leader down, because he is a godly leader. He's going to try to twist words around, get that leader to start being deceived. So he'll deceive the flock. He'll try to start getting that pastor to become overwhelmed with different trials or tests that may come up within the personal family of the pastor. A lot of attacks come on pastors and leaders in the kingdom. So we need to keep whoever is you are under, as far as leadership, your pastor or whoever it may be, keep them in prayer, keep lifting them up, because they are under a lot of attack every day. And I'm going to stop with that as far as for the leadership, but just remember that in the Bible, and there's more verses in the Bible that talk about leadership. We are not to be talking bad about our leaders, and I know that it's done all the time on Facebook. We may disagree with their decision, but we cannot disobey what God has said. We cannot talk bad about that leader, because that would be dishonoring and possibly step over into the rebellion type set. And God says rebellion is as witchcraft. So we have to be careful with our mouths, what we're saying. We can pray for those leaders. If the leaders are doing wrong, we need to lift them up and pray. We need to pray for them. Pray that their minds would be restored to God, or in a godly manner, so that they would make godly decisions, not instead of tearing them down, because they're placed there. So now let's surround them like we're surrounding our leaders of our churches, and just pray over them. And that's how we need to take care of any type of leadership that we see as ungodly. We need to pray for them, because we have to fight in the spiritual realm. We can't fight in the earthly realm what is placed in leadership, because God is in control of all leaders and He's in control of the White House. So whatever happens, God is still in control. But we as believers and part of the kingdom, we can pray for things to happen and to occur so that things can be restored back to a godly nation. It doesn't matter who's in the presidency or who's the governor of your state or Congress. We need to just keep them in prayer, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. Pray for them, keep them in prayer, because that's what we need to do. And so I'm going to stop with that, and I will see you next time. Thank you, and stay out of the heat. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful day. God bless.